September 1974. The wind bent frozen tree branches against the windows of the Stanley Hotel as Stephen King and his wife Tabitha pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. They had driven an hour north from Boulder, looking for a weekend escape, but something immediately felt off. The Grand Colonial Revival Hotel, perched 7,800 feet above sea level in Estes Park, Colorado, looked almost abandoned. "Can we still check in?" King asked the front desk. They could, but they would be the only guests. The hotel was closing for winter. Tomorrow. The clerk handed them a key. Room 217. The best room in the house. What happened that night in room 217 would spawn one of the most terrifying novels of the 20th century and transform an aging mountain resort into a pilgrimage site for horror fans worldwide. But here's what almost nobody asks. Why room 217? What made that specific room the perfect crucible for King's nightmare? And what was already waiting there when he arrived? Freelan Oscar Stanley had been dying. In 1903, tuberculosis was eating away at the steam-powered automobile inventor's lungs, and doctors gave him little hope. So he did what many lungers of that era did. He fled to the Rocky Mountains, seeking the thin, dry air that was the only treatment available. It worked. Stanley's health improved so dramatically in Estes Park that he decided to return every summer. But there was a problem. There was nowhere luxurious enough for a man of his wealth and status to stay. So Stanley did what any millionaire inventor would do. He built his own hotel. The Stanley Hotel opened July 4, 1909, a 48-room masterpiece designed to cater to wealthy East Coast urbanites and tuberculosis sufferers seeking Colorado's healing climate. Stanley spared no expense. The hotel featured electricity, rare for the time, telephones in every room, and running water, revolutionary luxuries in the remote mountain town. But Stanley also installed something that would prove catastrophic: a backup system of acetylene gas lamps in every room, piped throughout the building in case of electrical failure. June 25, 1911, 7:50 p.m. Elizabeth Wilson, the hotel's dedicated head chambermaid, was making her rounds during a thunderstorm that had knocked out the hotel's power. At 28 years old, Wilson had moved from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, to work at the Stanley since its opening. She was thorough, professional, and completely unaware that a gas leak had filled the presidential suite, room 217, with odorless acetylene. She stepped through the doorway holding a lit candle. The explosion shattered the evening. Guests a mile away reported hearing the boom. The blast was so powerful it destroyed 10% of the 70,000-square-foot hotel, obliterating the entire west wing. A bathtub flew through the air. Plate glass windows on the ground floor shattered. Doors were ripped from their hinges. Elizabeth Wilson was launched through the floor. She crashed through to the McGregor dining room directly below, landing in a debris field of splintered wood, shattered glass, and twisted metal. Miraculously, she survived, but with 2 broken ankles and other injuries that would take months to heal. F.O. Stanley personally paid for her medical care. Elizabeth returned to work 2 months later and stayed at the hotel until the 1950s, retiring in her late 50s. She died in 1952 of heart failure. But according to hotel staff and guests over the decades since, Elizabeth Wilson never really left room 217. Fast forward to September 1974. Stephen King was 27 years old and professionally frustrated. He'd had success with Carrie and just turned in Salem's Lot, but both were set in Maine. He'd been tinkering with an idea about a boy with psychic abilities trapped in an abandoned amusement park, but the logistics weren't working. He was stuck. Then he and Tabitha found themselves in the Stanley Hotel, alone. They were served dinner in the empty dining room, accompanied only by canned orchestral music echoing through the halls. Every chair except theirs was turned upside down on the tables. The hotel was preparing to hibernate for winter. Skeleton crew only. "It was like God had put me there to hear that and see those things," King would later say. After dinner, Tabitha returned to room 217. King wandered the endless corridors of the empty hotel. He looked at the old fire hoses coiled on the walls. He walked past closed doors and imagined what might be behind them. He felt the oppressive weight of isolation, of being utterly alone in a massive building that should be full of life, but wasn't. That night, King had a nightmare. His 3-year-old son, Joe, called Danny in the dream, was running through the hotel's corridors looking back over his shoulder, eyes wide, screaming. Something was chasing him. Something with a life of its own. One of those fire hoses, thumping across the carpet like a serpent. King woke up drenched in sweat. He stepped onto room 217's balcony and lit a cigarette. By the time he stubbed it out, he had the entire backbone of The Shining worked out in his mind. The amusement park became the Overlook Hotel. The psychic boy became Danny Torrance. The isolation became the catalyst for Jack Torrance's descent into madness. In his own words, "Whatever it is that makes you want to make things up, it was turned on. I was scared, but I loved it." Here's the strange part. In all his interviews about that night, King has never explicitly stated that anything paranormal happened to him in room 217. He talks about the atmosphere, the dream, the creative inspiration. But he's notably silent on whether he experienced what so many other guests claim to experience. Did he see Elizabeth Wilson's shadow? Did his luggage get mysteriously unpacked? Did he feel that presence that unmarried couples report, a cold force settling between them in bed? Or was it simply that the hotel's oppressive emptiness and his own writerly imagination were enough to conjure the masterpiece that would define his career? The answer matters less than you'd think, because whether King experienced the supernatural or simply feared he might, room 217 got into his head, and through his novel, room 217 got into all of our heads. If you want to stay in the Stephen King suite, as room 217 is now officially called, you need to book months in advance. It's the most requested room at the Stanley Hotel, and it's easy to see why. The room is beautifully appointed, with a large king bed and a work desk. The views of the Rocky Mountains are spectacular, but guests report experiences. Luggage gets unpacked when they're not in the room. Shoes appear neatly lined up on the end of the bed. Lights flicker. Some feel a presence. Not malevolent, but watchful. Elizabeth Wilson, they say, is still doing her job. She was old-fashioned and proper in life, and apparently she remains so in death. Unmarried couples sleeping in the same bed sometimes wake to feel something wedging between them, a disapproving presence from a more morally rigid era. Single men occasionally find their bags packed and left outside the door. Elizabeth, it seems, has standards. Actor Jim Carrey requested to stay in room 217 while filming Dumb and Dumber at the Stanley in 1994. He was seen fleeing the room just 3 hours later, visibly shaken. To this day, 30 years later, he has never spoken publicly about what happened that night. What did he see? What did he feel? The same thing Stephen King experienced? Or something entirely different? Here's what we know for certain. On September 1974, Stephen King spent one night in room 217. He had a nightmare. He wrote a novel. That novel became a cultural phenomenon that has terrified readers for nearly 50 years. Here's what we don't know. What actually happened in that room? The Stanley Hotel sits on a foundation of quartz and limestone, geology that paranormal investigators believe can store and amplify spiritual energy. Room 217 was the site of a catastrophic explosion that nearly killed a woman. The same room inspired one of horror's greatest writers to create his most enduring work, and that room continues to unsettle, surprise, and occasionally terrify guests who dare to sleep there. Was King's experience the product of an overactive imagination, professional frustration, and perfect atmospheric conditions? Or did something reach out to him that night, something that recognized a storyteller who could share its story with the world? The Stanley Hotel offers ghost tours now. They screen The Shining on continuous loop in a dedicated theater. The 1997 ABC miniseries that King himself wrote and produced was filmed on location, with the Stanleys standing in for the fictional Overlook Hotel that Kubrick never used. But despite all the tours, all the documentaries, all the paranormal investigations, Room 217 keeps its secrets. It welcomes guests with elegant furnishings and mountain views. And occasionally, according to those who've stayed there, it reminds you that you're not quite alone. Elizabeth Wilson is still tidying up. The corridors still echo with phantom footsteps. And somewhere in the metaphysical space between imagination and reality, between dream and waking, between what we can explain and what we can only feel, Room 217 waits. It's ready for the next guest, the next story, the next nightmare. The question isn't whether something supernatural happened to Stephen King in 1974. The question is, what will happen to you?